go. The future is in pieces. All right. So, they say before we think about the future, we should think about the past. So I want to go back to 2003. So 2003 for me was an exciting point in time. This was, to me, really when CSS started taking off. I remember when Wired redesign came out, people really started taking CSS seriously because the web standards group, there were people like, we should make web standards a thing. We should be able to develop with CSS instead of having to use font tags around everything or tables to lay things out. And while with a lot of the work we were doing on our own personal sites, corporations weren't really willing to make that step. And Wired was the sort of the first major site, albeit for techies, to really demonstrate that we could use CSS to manage the look and feel of our website, that this was going to make our lives easier. And that was a great thing. And then shortly thereafter, ESPN went through a redesign process and again used CSS for their layout. And from there, things just were amazing, right? Like all these sort of techniques. I remember going to a list apart and seeing articles like sliding door and really being excited about the web. And it was also the time when blogs were exciting, where anytime you wanted to learn something, you could go to a friend's blog and see what they were writing about. Everybody was sharing these things. And a lot of the way I wrote CSS, I learned through this point in time. Now, when I think about the kind of sites that I was developing, though, they were relatively straightforward. Even, for all the clients that I worked for my own blog, for all the projects that I was working on, they were relatively straightforward. They had a home page and they had an inside page. And so all I had to do was, okay, well, I've got a header, I've got a sidebar, I've got a content area, and I've got this footer. I'm going to write all the CSS, and then I'm going to write any CSS for the stuff that changed, which is this one little block in the middle. And that meant that actually a lot of the CSS that I was writing was relatively straightforward. In fact, my own blog that I built 5 years ago, the CSS was 10K, uncompressed. Right? Like, can you imagine working on a code base that was only 10K? I would love that. Instead, I'm working on code bases that are like 2 megs in size, right? These huge monolithic projects. And yet, when I think of how I was coding at that time, I mean, you can see here, like I've got a header. I'm going to be very specific. I've only got one header, so I'm using IDs. And this is what every element in that header looks like. I have this main section, and every element in that looks like this. I have my comment section. And it's funny now to kind of go back and look at this, and I think, man, I was really specific about, styling the author name. Like, an author name has to be inside of a meta, has to be inside of a comment, has to be inside of this comments thing. How many authors did I have on my website that I needed a selector this long for my project? Because really, the thing that I cared about was just that little bit right there. I cared what the author name looked like, and I cared about what the comment number looked like. So I recognized, that even the stuff that I was doing, sure, my CSS was only 10K, but there was still a lot of room for improvement. I remember when I first came into Shopify, and the way that they build websites was very similar to the way I was building websites. You start with what one page looks like, and you continue to add stuff onto the bottom for every single page that was different. I mean, it almost looks like, when you cut a tree and you can see the rings, that's essentially what the CSS was. From the very first line of the project to the last line at the bottom, it became this sort of timeline of what the project looked like. And the thing is when you're working on a project like that, right, you start like taking a block out and you think the whole thing is going to fall down. Man, that cat's pretty good at playing Jenga. All right. So, you're worried about taking this little bit of CSS out and having the whole thing fall down. And these cats are really good at Jenga. Wow. Okay, let me use another analogy that might be a little bit more appropriate. Because you make these little changes, and things that you're not aware of start, changing somewhere else, and it just becomes this really frustrating process until the point when you just kind of want to give up and throw the whole thing in the garbage. Now, what I would normally like to do in a project like this is just burn it down. Right? Let's just get rid of the whole thing and start from scratch. And that's a great place to be. When I first started at Yahoo, we actually got to do that, and that was a great thing. Every line of HTML and CSS that I wrote was new. I think of all the client projects that I did as a freelancer or working at an agency. You come in, you do a fresh new design, you build all that fresh new code, and you deliver it, and you know what, you pretty much don't have to see it again. If things go terribly wrong, you just build it from scratch again. But sometimes we can't always do that, and at Shopify that was the case. We ended up taking that existing project and slowly changing it bit by bit into something that we could manage. So how do we do this? I came up with something I call SMACSS, which is kind of a fun thing to say, or if you like to be a little bit more wordy, a scalable and modular architecture for CSS. Now, the point behind SMACSS was to describe an approach to site design and development. I'm definitely that sort of like not invented here kind of person in the sense of I don't really like using third-party code. I've never used Bootstrap, I've never used Foundation, I've never used a CSS reset. I like to code everything by hand. And so when I was writing this, I was thinking about the kind of person I was. And so there's no repo, there's no library, there's nothing to download. It's really just a way of thinking about how you build a website. And that doesn't change whether or not you're building static CSS or you're using SASS or React or web components or whatever sort of technology you're using. The principles behind all this stuff is really the same. Now, what does it really mean to be modular? Because it turns out that there's actually a lot of things that can kind of get in the way of how to create this sort of modular system of components. So, from a dictionary perspective, a module is each of a set of standardized parts or independent units that can be used to construct a more complex structure. That sounds like an ideal thing. There's a lot of complex things like cars that use standardized parts. Even something as simple as a screw. I mean, there was a point in time where every manufacturer came up with a different screw type, and somebody finally said, hey, you know what? We should standardize, the heads of a screw. And that's where we get things like the Phillips screwdriver. Or for those Canadians in the audience, the Robertson. Anybody familiar with the Robertson? No? Oh, come on. And a lot of people might think, oh, this is like Lego, right? Like we get all these individual pieces and we can build these wonderful sites out of them. Except I hate Lego. I've got kids. I've stepped on I don't know how many pieces. And the thing is like Lego, I mean, if you imagine taking a set, let's say the Star Destroyer, right? You got the set and you just pour out all the pieces, but you don't use the instruction manual. Could you build that Star Destroyer? Can you build what you actually want out of that? And in reality, probably not, right? Like we need guides in order to be able to build that kind of complex thing. So to me, I think a better analogy is actually something like Tetris, right? Tetris gives you predefined components. They're still each made up of a single block, but they're done in different configurations, and they can only fit together in specific ways. And so in that way, I love Tetris. It's a fun game. I grew up on it. I had a Game Boy and played Tetris for hours. Like I said, there are hurdles to actually being truly independent. CSS, unfortunately, has a number of things that can be problematic. I've listed 4. Inheritance, Cascade, browser default styling, and just, you got a bunch of components. How do you actually put them together? How do they sit together on the page? So let's dive into the first one, inheritance. Now, inheritance, for the most part, is a good thing, right? Typography, it would be really annoying if we had to set, font family and font size on every single element on our page. which admittedly was actually how I started out, right? I started off with font tags around everything. I remember doing P class equals body text, P class equals body text, P class equals body text, until I realized, oh wait, I only needed a single P selector and then just say, this is what my font was gonna look like. And that was a great thing. It also applies to list styles and table styles. But for the most part, we want that kind of inheritance, right? We want to be able to just specify one thing at the top and have everything inherit from that. And to you React fans in the audience, inline styles won't save you from inheritance. So what can save us from that? Well, there's a new CSS property called all. Unfortunately, right now, the browser support is abysmal. I believe only Chrome and Opera support it right now. But this is actually a really handy thing, and I think this is going to be super useful for a lot of the projects that we're going to work on. So let's give an example of that. My apologies for the font size, so it's a little bit hard to read, but I'll explain it a little bit. We have a body selector that I've specified, font family Arial, and a color. And so if you look at the example in the bottom, you can see that the top example is in Arial and it's red. Fantastic. But you'll notice the second example, the second list, is kind of got the default styling. You know, where did that styling go? And that is because I created a selector and said all initial on that container. And as a result of that, it removed those styles and therefore sort of reset everything within that box. And so we can battle against inheritance when we need to. You know, we can be very judicious in our use of this for the kind of projects that we're working on. And we can even go a further step and say, let's say every element inside this container, we're going to reset the styles in that as well. And you'll notice it goes even further, right? All the default list styles are now completely gone. All the default margin and padding is gone to where we just get inline items. And that allows us to, you know, if you could imagine a CSS reset that was a single line that could reset everything and allow us to build up from that. So that's an extremely useful tool in dealing with inheritance. All right, so that was the first thing. The second thing is the Cascade. It's part of cascading style sheets. It's part of the name, right? This is a thing that we want. Because the Cascade is how the browser decides what properties to apply when you have multiple rules declared on the same element. And this is a really useful thing. And we essentially kind of layer on rules in a project. So for example, if I've got link, you know, I just want my color equals blue, then I need to start layering on different things. So in this case, hover, you know, I move my mouse over, I want to change the color. Now the Cascade means certain things. If I change the order of this, my hover is not going to work because the specificity is going to change how well this is, how that is going to calculate which properties get applied. And then of course we start adding new things, like I want links in the sidebar to look a little bit different. You know, and again, I want to add another one for the hover style. And let's say I have nav. Well, if my nav is inside my sidebar, which of these rules get to win? And that cascade can be a useful thing, but can also be a very difficult thing. Because, you know, if I need to deal with a new scenario, a new context in which this code lives, I have to come up with a new selector, and it usually means that I'm adding more CSS to override other CSS that I've already written. So how do we battle against this? One, really simply, don't write multiple rules for the same element. And that's a lot of what SMACSS tries to do. It says, okay, you're going to build this component, we're going to write the CSS just for that component, as opposed to saying, I want to write CSS for this HTML element when it's in this element, when it's inside this element, when it's inside the page. Because, you know, when we're building a complex system, that's really difficult to manage all those different variations that something might be in. Now, inline styles can save you here because we've moved the styles to the most immediate place, right? This is the element, this is the styles that it should have. But inline styles, for the most part, depending on how you're building your site, aren't going to be the most maintainable. So lastly, creating a structured layering system to prevent conflicts. And again, this is a lot of what SMACSS tries to do, where it has categorized the kind of CSS that we write, and we can layer on those things to understand how one thing should win out over another in order to get the desired style without having to create too much CSS. Okay, so that's two things. Third thing, browser defaults. Browsers, by default, give us certain styles, right? That's how we can use H1s and paragraphs and list items without having to add any CSS and still have a visual style that we understand. So these as well are generally good things. So to give you an example, I've got a button, sort of the hello world of CSS and HTML. We've got a button, and I create a class called button, and in here I give it some default styles. Now, this looks pretty good, but let's say I have a link and I want to make it look like a button. Now, by default, this isn't going to look 100% the same. And the reason why is because the browser gives links some different styles, things like text decoration underline. Right, that we now have to undo in order for that to work. So we have to add more CSS depending on the kind of HTML elements that we're trying to style. So there's a lot to do with the predictability of our HTML. How predictable is it? How much CSS do we have to write to override those particular things? So I mentioned all initial. We can do that where we basically say, okay, let's use that to obliterate all the browser defaults and start from scratch, and then add the things that I care about. The other way we can do it is to use predictable HTML. In other words, if I'm creating some CSS, that I am going to have some HTML behind it that I know is going to be there. So for example, if I'm styling a modal dialog, that modal dialog is going to have a certain HTML structure. It might have a div wrapper with a header element for the top, a footer element for the bottom, and maybe a div for the body. And I've got this very predictable structure that I know isn't going to change. Somebody's not going to swap out that header for just a regular div because things would break. So it's really important for us to have that predictable HTML. And so templating languages help us manage that. So if we're doing, whether you're using React, Ember, whatever kind of framework that you want to use, whether you're using static HTML, the ability to componentize, to separate, and create this sort of predictable HTML and CSS together allows us to manage our projects better. And then lastly, being able to put modules together. How do we align if I've got a button next to another button, what happens? Right? Yeah, I've got a button, a little send button, and I want to put another button beside it. Okay, well, that probably doesn't look as great, right? We would like a little bit of space between our buttons, and so we have to declare that somehow. So we might say, okay, well, if I have a button beside a button using the sibling selector, I'm going to have some margin. Awesome, I now have spacing. But of course, projects are not usually this simple. Maybe I have an input next to a button. And so what do I do then? Well, then I start adding more selectors. Well, when I have a button beside an input, it also should have margin. But you can imagine the complexity in how many different kinds of elements might a button be beside, that I start having to add a selector for every single case. Or I could just say, star plus star. Whenever something's beside something else, margin left, right? That could be a thing. But of course, designs get complex. Well, in this case, I have a button beside an input where I want them to be no margin, but when a button's beside a button, I do want a margin. And you can imagine I'm starting to throw more and more CSS to try to manage that. In fact, that kind of makes me want to feel like this. Let's just flip the table. Okay. So there's a couple different ways that I've managed this in the past. A lot of the stuff that I describe in the book is about separating layout from the module. So if you have a button and you need to lay these things out, actually creating new HTML elements with classes that define that relationship between components. That can make people feel a little uncomfortable because it means that we're adding more HTML in order to do this. The alternative is using something I like to call them micro layout classes. Some other people call them utility classes. But essentially that you have these elements that, these classes that just do one thing, like margin right 5 pixels or margin right 10 pixels. And you just kind of litter these things throughout the HTML to tweak the layout between these components. I don't have a hard and fast rule between either of these. I recognize that, when you're building a site, the answer is usually, it depends. There's so many different ways to build things. If there was only one true way, we'd all be done by now. We don't need a whole day of learning about CSS. So, if we take the first approach, then we're wrapping everything around and we have to kind of describe what is this thing. Like maybe I say, like when I have inline elements next to each other, there's going to be a certain padding beside them. Or if I wanted to use a microclass, then I might do this thing, MLS might mean margin left small. And so I could set up a bunch of different sort of microclasses to manage my project that way. Aha, bonus problem. Fun times. Media queries. Thank you. I love Keynote. So when it comes to media queries, I mean, we all love responsive web design, I'm sure. It is a very useful technique in designing our websites. However, it kind of throws a wrench into a component-based approach to site design. So for example, if this was my site, let's say a logo to the left, I've got some navigation to the right, and then below that I've got these boxes. And these boxes are essentially the same thing. Let's say it's a news item, but I want 4 across the top, and underneath I want sort of 2 side by side. How do we lay that out in a consistent way? And then I decide that, I'm going to move to a smaller screen. How do those boxes respond? And the thing is that I need to say, if module A is in module B in layout C, I have to know the complexity of all of these things together. And I need to know under every single variation that might happen. So, if I have a particular box on a page, I have to know, at what point when I resize the entire page, does that one box change? And so I need to know the context of that box inside of all the other boxes before I can make those kind of rules. When in reality, what I really want to do is say, if module A has room, do this. And so, hey, great solution, element queries. Fantastic. Also known as container queries. Go out and use them today? Damn it. Browsers don't have the concept of element queries yet, unfortunately. At Shopify, we ended up using JavaScript to solve that problem. JavaScript is, it's got its pros and cons, but it allowed us to build stuff in that sort of component-based approach. We could say, based on the amount of space that this module has, do this. And that gives us a lot of flexibility in knowing that we have designed this component, we've designed this component, and just based on the amount of space it has, it's going to do what we want it to do. So it just makes things a lot easier to manage. So far I've been talking about a lot of things that make CSS difficult in the kind of stuff that we're developing. Let's kind of get back to what SMACSS is all about, which is really about patterns, right? Patterns are a good thing. If everything was the same look and feel, if all the text was the same size, there would be no hierarchy, there would be nothing for us to sort of latch onto and understand the hierarchy of the page. How do I know what I should be paying attention to at any given time? And so we do things like change position, right? We want things to stand out. We're going to move it from everything else. We might change its color or its size or its shape. Right? These are very useful tools that designers need when building out their sites. The problem is that if everything is special, nothing's special. And we end up with projects like this. I stole this slide from Brad Frost, and this was a website that he was working on. These were all from the same project, and all the different button styles that they had on that project. So as you can see, there's not really any kind of consistency in this. And here's the other thing, is that design has a cost. Now, as a print designer, most print designers know that they're not going to be able to necessarily get away with having a 4-color print with embossing on the thickest paper that they want. They recognize that there's going to be a certain cost to that. And the same thing applies to web design. Every new piece of design that you create is going to end up in code. That code is going to get downloaded. It needs to be processed by the browser. And so you have, obviously a lot of expense that can go into building a website. I certainly know when I travel, having to deal with slow websites that just won't load, and I need that information right away. The kind of costs just of downloading that information. Not everybody has, super cheap, high-speed internet. So it's really important to understand, how the stuff that we're designing. The more unique pieces that we design, the more code that we need to build, the more code we need to maintain, right? So do we want to build projects that are easy to maintain, or do we want the sort of complexity where the only way to move forward is to destroy it and build from scratch again? And that means that we kind of need to shift our thinking. We can start, continue on with a sort of page-based view of things, or we can kind of strip away the page and look at the components, see the patterns through our project. And the way I look at that is that, if I'm writing CSS, I care about a couple of things. One is categorization. The CSS that I'm writing, it is doing a certain role within my design. What is that role? And then I'm going to use naming convention to clarify that role. And that's pretty much all SMACSS is. So what kind of categories do we have? We've got base styles. So those are like your CSS resets if you do use them. I think there's going to be generally just some basic stuff like, I'm going to set my body to this, I'm going to set my H1s to this, and just set whatever those sort of default styles are across the site. And then from there, I kind of, I'm working outside in that I've got a layout. So I've got a header, I've got a footer, I've got a sidebar, I've got a content area, and then I'm going to put my actual pieces of content in there. My header might have a logo, it might have a navigation, it might have a search box. My sidebar might have links to popular articles and maybe an about us and all these different things that we want. So the layout is this container for all these different things. Same thing with like grid systems, right? Again, we're not really talking about the content, we're just talking about these containers that we know we're going to put a bunch of stuff in, and we don't know what that stuff is yet. And so once we actually get to the actual stuff, right, the actual navigation, the logo, the search box, the article, those are our modules. Those are the pieces that we want to design, the sort of the individual independent components that we're going to put into our system. And then on top of that is theming. Now, when I think of theming, the way I look at it is from a user perspective. In other words, does the user need the ability to change the look and feel on the fly? If you're just building a box to look like blue, that to me isn't a theming thing, but if the user needs to be able to change that box from blue to red, that to me is a theming thing. So most projects don't even need theming, but some do, right, depending on the kind of projects that you're working on. And then the last sort of layer or category on top of that is state. And what the state does is it changes the look and feel of something, again, usually based on JavaScript. If I click on a button, I might need to turn it into an active state. If I'm using pagination and I get to the first page, I might need to have a disabled state. An object can exist in any number of different states, and we just want to describe what that looks like. So once we have the categorization, having a naming convention to understand how that works. And now, when I wrote the book, I had my own naming convention. At the time, I didn't know anybody else that had any kind of naming convention when they wrote their CSS classes. It turns out actually BEM had already been around for a while, and it had a naming convention, which has really taken off. I think for the most part, most people I know use a BEM style naming convention where we've got the double hyphens and the double underscore, which is great. If you're using SASS, we can use the ampersand to kind of cut ourselves out of having to repeat module names all the time. Or if you are using something like CSS modules with React, then we might have a button CSS file, and then we create a bunch of CSS in there, and it will actually compile down to create a button hyphen variation and a button hyphen component for us. But they're all really solving the same problems. In other words, we're finding out, okay, what is this thing? What is this module? And once I've declared that, I want the module variations. And then I want any child elements associated with that parent element. And every single naming convention, every single sort of technique that I've seen out there all fit into the same approach. Now, a lot of this, again, is about isolation, right? That I'm creating this little bit of HTML. I'm going to associate some very specific CSS with this. I might associate some very specific JavaScript with this. And then I want to be able to take that and include it into my project. And I want to be able to take multiple of these things and include it in my project. And there have been a number of JavaScript libraries over the years that have tried to solve this problem in different ways. Ext.js was one, Dojo, jQuery UI. I mean, they all had their CSS, their JavaScript, and their HTML that would build out these interfaces. These days, though, most people would probably think maybe the future is React. And there's a lot of pluses to using something like React. Now, this might not make a whole lot of sense. In this case, I am creating this new component called XUI button. XUI button is actually a button, the company I work for now, Zero. So we have our Zero UI buttons that we want to create that I can control what the HTML behind that is going to look like. So I'm going to say the XUI button has this very specific HTML. And I can add in, use JavaScript to add in whatever kind of behavior that I want into this particular component. And then I can associate very specific CSS with this component. And to me, this is one of the things, like a lot of people talk about React and whether or not like inline styles are a thing, and yet conceptually to me, it's the same as, what SMACSS does, what OOCSS does, this componentization, this isolation of concerns. So we're really just doing the same thing. Maybe the future is web components, right? I'm sure you guys, how many of you have heard of web components? Awesome. Of course, they're not quite here yet, but web components are built up of four things. We've got templates, shadow DOM, custom elements, and HTML imports. So let's take a look at creating a shadow DOM. So the shadow DOM, we can create an element, we create a shadow DOM, and then we can throw some stuff in there and append this to the document. So what kind of benefits does that give us? Well, one, the Cascade no longer applies. So in other words, any selectors that I had targeting HTML elements or even class names that I was using inside that HTML snippet will no longer apply. Inheritance still applies, but as we know, we can still use all initial to cancel out inheritance. But this gives us that isolation. So to give you an example of this, again, with this code here, I have a simple span, and I say anytime I have stuff in a span, it should be the color blue. And so if I create a new shadow DOM, I give it some CSS, and I append it to that, it will also be blue, because I've put it into that span, it's going to do its thing. Whereas you'll notice that span that the var HTML equals span, so I'm adding a new span, but when I just append it to the parent document, so in other words, it's no longer inside of another span, it's not blue. And that's because the Cascade, those styles aren't applying directly. They will be applied via inheritance. So again, when we look at web components, this ability to isolate our stuff and make sure that the styles that are outside of it don't affect it, and the styles within it don't affect anything else. So, that encapsulation is really useful. So within that web component, we can actually bundle that code up into its own HTML file. And then we can import it into a regular document. So we've got that ability to completely isolate and import this into our document and use it throughout our page. Now, we need some way of replicating code over and over again. And that's where the template comes in, where we can define this sort of inert HTML that won't actually render anything onto the page until we actually use it. And that's where we can create the shadow DOM using the template in order to generate huge swaths of code within our project. And we can use the content element to pull stuff out of our actual HTML and pull it into the web component to be used. So we can do things like this image inside of this custom element. In this case, when it gets pulled in here, when I say select equals image, that image will actually get pulled in. And from a CSS perspective, we can actually do some pretty neat things. Like if you could imagine building out a page of HTML that has like 4 or 5 different elements, and then we can use a web component to change the layout, the position of all these different things however we want, just restructuring in this way. So our default HTML document ends up being actually really simple, really basic and straightforward. So a pretty handy thing. And then just so an example of that where we grab the code and then register that custom element that I've created. And so we've used all the different components into our project. Now, as exciting as web components are, I know you guys sound pretty excited right now. It's probably going to be about a year before all the browsers support everything. So Chrome has definitely tried to jump out ahead. They have their Polymer framework. There's a bunch of polyfills that try to fill the gaps, but things like Shadow DOM, it's kind of hard to polyfill that. And so some shadowy DOM stuff that kind of work, but for now, I know certainly the recommendation I've been putting forward within Zero was let's hold off a little bit longer until we start seeing more widespread support. I expect that Safari next year will have it. I know Firefox has been doing a bunch of development, but they've been on the fence about a couple components. And a really good talk to check out is Philip Walton's talk on modular CSS with web components. Definitely check that out. And one of the other downfalls of this is that it is JavaScript dependent, which is not fantastic, right? Even if you're doing something in React, you can do server-side generation and build out a static page by using React on the server. And then being progressively enhanced, whereas with web components, you're not going to be able to do that. It requires JavaScript to work. And not everybody has JavaScript turned on. I know people in this audience who keep their JavaScript turned off. And people often like it, right? But performance is fantastic because you're not loading ads across so many different websites. So it's something to consider. I do hope that they think about maybe how to be able to do progressively enhanced web components. I think that'd be pretty cool. Okay, so with all this, think about standardized and modular design, right? When you're building something out, how do you break down your design in a way that you have these components that you can reuse? I think that's a fantastic thing. Now, frameworks like React can help in that conceptually you're forced into that methodology. It's still possible to fuck it up. But I think the fact that it does encourage this is a good thing. And of course, web components are coming. Winter is coming too, although it's Phoenix, so it's not too bad. And on that note, thank you very much.